Two people retired from the same company last spring. Or rather, one of them retired. They started the same year, walked the same hallway, parked in the same lot for almost 3 decades. One of them left at 58 with enough money to never think about money again. The other is 67, still badging in every morning, still running numbers in his head at his desk, still quietly hoping nobody asks him why he hasn't gone yet. The woman who walked out early earned $52,000 a year. The man who can't afford to leave earned 95. Say those two numbers to yourself slowly, because almost everything you've been told about money assumes they should be the other way around. When people hear a story like this, the first thing they do is go looking for the trick, an inheritance nobody mentioned. A house bought for nothing back in 1970. One lucky bet on the right stock at the right moment. There wasn't one. Diane didn't have a secret second income. She didn't marry money. She never once made a dramatic financial decision in her life. And that, it turns out, was the entire point. The distance between those two people was never the paycheck. It was the space between what came in and what quietly stayed. Diane spent her whole career living inside that space on purpose. Gary spent 30 years letting it close, one reasonable decision at a time. There's a number that matters far more than your salary, and most people couldn't tell you theirs if you asked. It's the share of what you earn that you never spend, not what happens to be left at the end of the month, but what you decide, in advance, will never be touched. Diane's number was 30. 30 cents of every dollar, gone before it ever reached her hands. Gary's number, for most of his life, was close to nothing, and he would have told you, with complete honesty, that it wasn't his fault. I want to walk you through how a woman earning barely half as much crossed the finish line 9 years ahead of him, because it has nothing to do with being clever about money, and everything to do with a handful of small choices she made when no one was paying attention. None of them needed a raise. Most of them felt like nothing in the moment. That's exactly why they were so easy for Gary to skip. It's worth starting with the year they were both promoted, because that's where the two paths first split, and neither of them noticed it happen. They got the same bump, a little over $4,000 each. Gary did what almost everyone does with a raise. He absorbed it. Not into anything foolish, nothing you could point at. A slightly nicer apartment, closer to the office. A car payment that felt earned after years of driving something older. Dinners out that stopped being an occasion and started being a Tuesday. Within about 2 months, the raise had disappeared into his life so completely that he felt exactly as stretched as he had before it. He'd tell you he got a raise that year. His bank account never found out. Diane got the same $4,000 and did something that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. She raised the amount that moved automatically into savings, and she left everything else exactly where it was. Same apartment, same car, same grocery list. The raise she never saw was a raise she could never lose to a slightly fancier version of her own life. That's the quiet mechanism underneath this whole story. It isn't dramatic. It never is. A raise you feel is a raise that's already gone. A raise you don't feel is a raise that goes to work for you for the next 30 years. Watch what that does over time, because the gap between them didn't grow in a straight line. It grew the way these things always grow. Slowly, then all at once. The biggest lever, for Diane and for almost everyone, was the roof over her head. When Gary's income climbed, so did his address. A house instead of an apartment. Then a bigger house, because the first one started to feel small once the people around him had bigger ones. Each move made sense on the day he made it. He could afford the payment. The bank said yes. And every one of those yeses locked a little more of his future income into a fixed cost he could no longer question. By his 40s, more than a third of everything he earned was going to a house that mostly impressed people who didn't matter to him. Diane made one decision early, and simply never reversed it. She kept her housing cheap. For years that meant a roommate, in a place she could have technically afforded to have to herself. Later it meant a small home she bought and then just stopped upgrading. That single choice, held steady across a career, freed up something like $500 a month, compared to living the way Gary lived. $6,000 a year, every year, flowing somewhere other than a mortgage company. She didn't feel poor. She felt like a person who had already decided what enough looked like, and had no reason to keep moving the line. I want to slow down on one particular afternoon in Gary's life, because it's the kind of moment that decides a retirement, and it never once feels like it. He was 41. The first house had been fine, more than fine, but he'd been in it 8 years, and something about it had started to feel like a size he'd outgrown. The way a coat you've had too long stops feeling like yours. A colleague had just moved into a new development across town, and Gary had gone to see it, and he'd driven home quieter than he'd left. The next weekend he found himself standing in an empty living room with high ceilings, and a realtor who understood, without being told, exactly what he was feeling. She didn't sell him anything. She just let the room do it. She mentioned that homes like this held their value. She mentioned the school district, though his kids were nearly grown. She mentioned, almost in passing, that at his income the payment was well within reach, and the word reach did something to him. It made the whole thing sound like growth instead of what it was. The numbers worked. That was the trap. They always work, right up until the day they don't. The bank approved him in an afternoon. The new payment was about $1,100 a month more than the old one, and he told himself, standing in that echoing room, that $1,100 was nothing spread across a life like his. And he was right, in the smallest possible way. It was nothing. On any given month. It was only everything when you added up all the months, and stacked them next to the retirement he didn't know he was trading away. $1,100 a month, for the 25 years he'd carry that mortgage, is the better part of $1 million. He didn't buy a bigger house that afternoon. He bought 9 extra years at his desk, and he signed for them with a smile, because it genuinely felt like the reward for everything he'd done right. Nobody warned him, because the decision looked like success from every angle a person could see it from. His family was proud. His colleague was a little envious. The house was, by any ordinary measure, lovely. That's the thing about the choices that quietly cost you your freedom. They almost never look like mistakes. They look like the good life, arriving right on schedule. Diane, that same year, was living in the same small place she'd bought years earlier, watching the mortgage shrink instead of reset. She didn't feel like she was missing anything, because she'd never started the comparison that Gary couldn't stop running. She wasn't denying herself a bigger house. She simply didn't want one badly enough to sell 9 years of her life for it. Put that way, it wasn't even a sacrifice. It was just arithmetic she'd made peace with a long time ago. That word, enough, deserves a moment, because it's the thing Gary never did. He never defined enough, so he never arrived. Every time his income rose, his idea of a normal life rose with it, which meant he needed the next raise just to feel like he was making progress. He earned more than almost everyone he knew and felt, somehow, like he was always slightly behind. There's a name for that treadmill, and the cruel part is that walking faster never gets you off it. Only stepping off does. The car told the same story on a smaller scale. Gary rolled one vehicle into the next every few years. Always something newer. Always a payment. Diane drove a paid-off, unremarkable, completely dependable car until it genuinely stopped being dependable, and then she bought another modest one with cash. Over a lifetime, that one habit is worth more than most people's retirement accounts, and it's invisible, because nobody has ever been impressed by a car that isn't there. And then there were the small things, the subscriptions, the upgrades, the steady, quiet drift of a life that costs a little more every year for reasons no one can quite explain. Gary never audited any of it. Why would he? Each piece was too small to notice. Diane looked at hers once a year, the way you'd check the oil in a car, and cut whatever had stopped earning its place. Not out of discipline, exactly. More out of a kind of attention that most people never turn toward their own money. Here's where I should be honest about the math, because it's less impressive than you'd think, and that's what makes it believable. Diane took home around $42,000 a year after taxes on that $52,000 salary. Living the way she did, she was moving something close to $1,300 a month into savings and investments, without ever feeling like she was sacrificing, because she'd built her whole life to run on what was left. $1,300 a month is not a fortune. It will not go viral. But left alone for nearly 3 decades, growing quietly the way money does when you stop interrupting it, it became somewhere north of $1 million. Add a house with no mortgage and a life that only cost about $30,000 a year to run, and you have a woman who, at 58, simply did not need her job anymore. Gary, earning $95,000, was saving about 5%, and started taking even that seriously far too late. He has a few $100,000, a large mortgage, and a lifestyle that has to be fed every single month. On paper, he was the success story of the office for 30 years. Underneath the paper, he was the one who couldn't stop. If this is the first time the math has ever looked like this to you, that a smaller income can quietly beat a larger one, stay with me, because I break down one of these real money stories every week, and they all come back to this same uncomfortable idea. The uncomfortable idea is this: income is what people see. It's the number on the offer letter, the thing you mention at a dinner, the figure that decides how impressed a stranger is. But income has almost nothing to do with wealth. Wealth is what you don't spend. It's the part that never shows up in the car, or the house, or the vacation photos. It's built entirely out of the purchases you quietly chose not to make, which is why it's nearly impossible to see from the outside, and why nobody ever gave Diane credit for it until the day she walked out the door. So what do you actually do with all this, if you're somewhere in the middle of your own career, watching your raises disappear the way Gary's did? You start by finding your number, the share of what you earn that you keep. Most people have never once calculated it, and the figure tends to be lower and more sobering than they expect. You can't change a number you refuse to look at. Then you make saving the thing that happens first, not the thing that happens if there's anything left. There never is anything left. So you flip the order. On the day the money arrives, a fixed amount moves out of reach before you can build a life around it. You decide once, and then you get out of your own way. That single reversal does more than any amount of willpower spread across 100 small daily decisions, because willpower runs out by Wednesday, and an automatic transfer never does. Then, when the next raise comes, and it will, you let it pass through you into that same account before your life expands to swallow it. A career has only so many raises in it. Gary spent all of his on a lifestyle he can no longer put down. Diane banked hers, and they're the reason she's home on a Tuesday morning while he's still at his desk. And underneath all of it, you decide what enough looks like before your income decides for you. Not out of fear, and not out of some grim idea that comfort is the enemy. Just because a life with no finish line is a life you can never actually win. Diane picked her line early and stopped running the moment she reached it. That was the whole trick. There was never anything more to it than that. I keep coming back to the mornings. That's the part the numbers never quite capture. Gary's mornings still belong to someone else. The alarm, the badge, the meetings that could have been anything, the slow arithmetic of how many more years, until he can finally stop. He earned nearly twice what Diane earned, for 30 years, and he bought himself a life he now can't leave. Diane's mornings belong to her, not because she was lucky, and not because she was gifted with money in some way you aren't. She just refused, quietly and for a very long time, to let the space between what she earned and what she kept close up on her. She never looked wealthy. That was always the point. The wealth was the freedom, and freedom, it turns out, is almost invisible until the exact moment you get to use it. There's one piece of this I haven't told you yet, and it's the part her coworkers most wanted to understand. Not how she saved it, how she grew it. Because $1,300 a month sitting in an ordinary savings account would never have become what it became. The money did most of the work on its own, in a way that has nothing to do with picking stocks and everything to do with where she chose to let it sit and wait. That's where this story goes next.